In an unpublished article for the Washington Post, you wrote that the NAFTA protests during the 90s in Mexico gave, quote, only a bare glimpse of time bombs waiting to explode. Do you think the drug cartels in Mexico are a byproduct of the trade inequalities you explained in the Post article? Also, if you could talk about the roles international banks and corporations play in the war on drugs.
Well, I can't really talk about it because there isn't any war on drugs. I mean, if there was a war on drugs, the government would take measures which it knows could control the use of drugs. And it's pretty well understood. I mean, years ago, I don't know, maybe 25, 30 years ago, there was, right at about the time that Nixon's first war on drugs was called, there was a big study by the Army and the Rand Corporation, the main outside advisory research bureau, analyzing the effects on drug use of various approaches to it. And they, I think study 4, the one that came out best, most cost effective, least cost, most effectiveness, was prevention and treatment by a large margin. Next, much more expensive and less effective was police work. Still less effective and more costly was border interdiction. And least effective and most costly was out-of-country operations, like chemical warfare in Colombia. Well, the methods that are used are the exact opposite. Most of the funding goes into cross-border operations, the least effective, most costly, next interdiction and police action, and least to prevention and treatment. And there's a pretty independent evidence that this is correct. So, for example, smoking, let's say, is far more destructive than drugs, I mean, by orders of magnitude. Now, there is no, it's not, you don't carry out chemical warfare in North Carolina, Kentucky, you don't interdict the borders because it's produced here. You don't arrest kids for having a cigarette. But in fact, prevention and treatment have sharply reduced smoking. In fact, not even policies. Throughout the 1980s, there was a general shift among large sectors of young people, not everybody, but a general shift towards more healthy lifestyles. So you have a reduction in smoking, you have a reduction in the use of red meat, in alcoholism, and a whole pile of things. And that worked. If you walk around a college campus, you rarely see kids with cigarettes. If you go down the slums, you do. But that's because the social cultural change was kind of class-based. But it worked. And as I say, it's even things like red meat. People eat healthier diets, young people. And that's pretty much what the Rand Army approach predicted. So that suggests, since policy has been followed for decades, which were known in advance to be have exactly the wrong properties, and it's shown by evidence that they do have the wrong properties, but they continue with them. Well, to a rational person, it suggests that something else is going on in the planning, and I don't think it's hard to figure out. Out-of-country operations are just a cover for counterinsurgency, or for clearing land in Colombia, so that driving out peasants, so that multinational corporations could come in for mining and resource extraction and agribusiness and monocrop production and so on, which is why you have probably outside of Afghanistan, probably the largest refugee population in the world in Colombia. It's not affecting drug production. In fact, it's going up. It went up, I think, about 25% last year. But it's going to continue because that wasn't the purpose. In the country, here in the United States, the drug war has been associated clearly with a very sharp rise in incarceration. So you go back to, say, 1980, prison population in the United States was, per capita, was approximately like other industrial countries, kind of toward the high end, but not off the chart. I mean, now it's 5 to 10 times as high. It's still going up. And most of it, a very substantial part of it, is drug-related. Also the length of sentences, and repeated sentences, and so on. And it mostly targets the what are called the dangerous classes, the poor, minorities and so on. So like black males, it's astronomical. On the other hand, drug use among wealthy people is barely prosecuted. So it's a class-based form of control of superfluous population. And for that purpose, it seems to be working. In fact, it's also making a lot of money for commercial enterprises. What some criminologists call the prison industrial complex has been a pretty substantial development, and especially for rural counties. It's a godsend. That's where they build the prisons, brings in construction work, jobs, surveillance. A couple of years ago, maybe still, the fastest growing white collar profession was security officer. And it gets rid of people you don't have anything to do with. They don't have a place in the current industrial system. And there's also racial elements involved. So you can say that the drug war is a success for what are probably its real purposes, but not for its proclaimed purposes. There was just a study initiated by 3 pretty conservative former Latin American presidents, Cardoso, Gaviria, and Zedillo. And they came out with the conclusion, which anybody who's watching it knows is correct, but since it came from that source, it was publicized, namely that the drug war in Latin America has been a complete failure in terms of its proclaimed objectives. But that just tells you those weren't the proclaimed objectives. I mean, rational people don't keep pursuing a policy that's failing when they know there's a better policy, unless there's some other reason. And I think the other reason is not terribly hidden. So you can't really talk about a war on drugs. You go back to the question and formulate it differently. It would be based on a different assumption.
I wanted to ask you that our country, for a country predicated on separation of church and state, I was wondering, why do you think that we let religion dictate so much of our lives and public policy?
Well, those are 2 questions that are different. As far as our lives are concerned, the United States has always been an unusually religious country. I mean, the country was founded by religious extremists. The Puritans who came over were, waving the holy book and following the Lord's commands when they exterminated the Amalekites and so on. And the Scotch-Irish immigration that followed, German immigration, were also highly religious. And it's been a very fundamentalist country.
Yeah.
And there are repeated fundamentalist revivals, great revivals. One of the last ones was in the 1950s. And that's where you get these things like, in God we trust, our nation under God, and all that kind of business. And it's a streak in American society, which differentiates it from other industrial societies pretty sharply, in fact. But those are individual choices. As far as influencing public policy is concerned, that's mostly the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
It started, I think, Carter, inadvertently, he's probably perfectly honest, he sort of taught a lesson to party managers, namely that if you pretend to be religious, you can pick up a big electoral block. And in fact, every candidate for president since Carter has made a big show of, being in church. And even people like Clinton are probably about as religious as I am.
Yeah.
They've always made a show of walking out of the Baptist church every Sunday morning and so on. That's a way to pick up a lot of votes cheap.
Yeah.
It was understood, and that has a associated effect, namely the constituency begins to have effects on policy, and that was exploited. So one of the ways of, it's been a funny economic period for the last 30 years. We've been through 30 years with real wage stagnation. That has never happened before.
Yeah.
There's been economic growth, not like before, but considerable. There's been a sharp rise in productivity, but the effects have flown and gone in very few pockets. For the majority of the population, it's been a bad period. Stagnation, sometimes decline, reduction of benefits, higher working hours, a lot of breakdown of social structure. It's hard for people to deal with. Now, the parties don't want to deal with this because their constituency is basically business and wealthy. So they'd like to divert attention to other topics. And those are called social issues, like stem cell research, abortion, and so on. These become not individual matters anymore, which they were before, but rather social policy, and are used, and I presume designed, to keep away from the issues that really affect people. Like, take, say, health insurance, or take, say, the drug war. People would like to reduce drugs, but you don't want to pay attention to the real issue, because the drug war is serving other purposes.
Right.
Or take healthcare, let's say. I mean, healthcare has been the top issue, or close to the top issue, for the population for decades, and for good reasons. And the healthcare system's a complete disaster. It's about twice the per capita cost of other comparable countries, and some of the worst outcomes. And enormous numbers of people either uninsured or underinsured. And that's something people feel in their lives, so they care about it. And they also have an opinion. Ever since polls have been taken, a large majority want a national healthcare system, meaning getting rid of the privatized healthcare system. But here you have a real conflict, because the pharmaceutical corporations and the insurance industry and related industries want a privatized system, and the public is opposed, so you have to somehow marginalize that question. It's usually described in the press as politically impossible, meaning the only thing for it is the large majority of the population, but lacking political support and so on, or how difficult it would be to put it through, and so on. But not particularly difficult. You'd extend Medicare to the whole population, which is what a large part of the majority wants, but it runs into the interests that really set policy. So the goal is to divert attention away from those things to some other things. It's the sort of Reagan Democrat phenomenon. And in that respect, religion can be mobilized. The religious commitments that have always been there can be mobilized into a political force. And I think that's happened. So I think that, going back to your question, there's a difference between the fact that it's individual choice, and it happens to be an extremely religious country, way off the charts, to policy. And its impact on policy has been mostly recent, pretty much coinciding with the period of harsh economic and social reality for the population. And I think it can be understood plausibly as a conscious diversion from issues that party managers and their constituency don't want discussed. In fact, during this period, the public relations industry, huge industry, has been very frank about the fact that they are marketing candidates like commodities. In fact, it wasn't published much here, but after the Obama election, the advertising industry gave Obama their award for the best marketing campaign of the year. And they're right, great marketing campaign, hope, change, no content, and so on. And they went on to say that this is, top executives were quoted in the business press as saying that they've been marketing candidates ever since Reagan, and this is the best achievement they've ever had.
It's unsettling.
But, it makes good sense. I mean, if you look at, these guys study public opinion closely, naturally, and they're perfectly aware that on a host of major issues, both political parties are pretty well to the right of the population. So it makes good sense to keep away from issues and to focus on personalities, qualities. It's not just for the general population, it's also true for the intellectual elite. So I sometimes torture myself by listening to NPR, and I happened to pick up an interview that they were having. It was after one of the Clinton-Obama debates during the primaries, and they were interviewing the New York Times political correspondent, I forget her name, and they went on for about 10 or 15 minutes, and the discussion was mostly about things like this, that apparently at the beginning of the debate, Clinton walked in and Obama sort of held her chair while she sat down. And the question was about his body language. Was he deferential, white lady, black boy,
Jesus.
or was he kind of contemptuous, lady?
Yeah.
So that was a discussion. Not about what they were talking about, not about the issues. And that's, I think, maybe it's not even conscious anymore.
Yeah.
So internalized. It's internalized that you want to keep away from issues.
I bet it was marooned out.
Do you think fascism is inevitable in a capitalistic society?
Well, the term fascism has taken on a special connotation. In the 1930s, pre-Hitler, or before the Holocaust, the real effects of Hitler were concerned, it wasn't considered a particularly negative term. It was considered a notion of social organization. So, for example, Roosevelt was a great admirer of Mussolini. That admirable Italian gentleman. American investors loved Mussolini. They poured money into it. Into Italian capitalism was controlling the workforce. It was orderly. It was running things. They were making plenty of profit. In fact, Fortune magazine had a big story in the early 30s about, which had a headline about Mussolini saying, "The wops are unwopping themselves." The wops are finally getting things straight. And they had a real good fascist government.
Wow.
And pretty much the same is true with Hitler. Like the State Department in 1937, I think, described Hitler as a moderate, standing between the extremes of right and left. And Sumner Wells, Roosevelt's main advisor, came back from the Munich conference. That's 38. Saying, real hope, we can really work with Hitler. He's kind of a good guy. And again, American investment shot up in Germany. The business classes liked him. It was even more so in England. And in fact, you read back, the really serious political economists like Robert Brady, one of the best, kind of a Veblenite political economist. He described fascism as just a tendency that the industrial world is moving towards, including the New Deal as an example of coordinated state planning for corporate structures in the interest of business, controlling things and so on. I mean, in that sense, you could say, yeah, some kind of fascism is like an aspect of capitalism. But what the term has come to mean now is stormtroopers, extermination camps, other such things, aggression. And in that sense, it's no reason to expect it. Counterproductive.
But do you think there's a way to be sort of an egalitarian society?
In principle.
Right.
Sure.
With capitalism being the main...
No, capitalism is, it's kind of interesting. If you read Adam Smith, the great hero, one of his arguments, he argued in favor of markets, but kind of nuanced arguments, not as extreme as his thought. But one of his arguments, in fact, one of his main ones, was that under conditions of perfect liberty, markets would lead to perfect equality. Not a very good argument, but that was the argument. Mm. And he took perfect equality to be a desideratum, something we want. And he meant equality of condition, not opportunity. He said that's what markets should lead to, and there's a kind of an argument for that. But under real-world conditions, it goes the other way for all kind of reasons. I mean, one reason, and there are a lot of built-in serious inefficiencies to markets. Mm-hmm. In fact, we're suffering from some of them right now. One of the major properties of markets, if you take a good economics course, you learn this in the first term, is that they underprice social effects. Mm-hmm. So like if you sell me a car, say, we can make a good deal for ourselves. We both gain from it. But he's paying costs. Mm. So there's more pollution, there's more congestion, price of oil goes up. And these effects are spread through the population. When you count them all, they can be quite large. It's called externalities. Economists put them in a footnote, but they're not so small. And when you get financial institutions, there's an effect which is called systemic risk. So if, say, Goldman Sachs makes a loan, if they're managed well, they take into account the effect to themselves if the loan goes sour. but they don't take into effect, they don't count in the consequences to the system as a whole if the loan goes sour. And that's what's happening now. You underprice risk, and so there's too much of it. There are other factors that also lead to too much of it, and then sooner or later it unravels. You have a major crisis. So these are just properties of markets, and there are other properties. Like say, when I go home tonight, I have a choice on the market. I can choose to go home in a Ford or a Toyota, but I can't choose to go home in a public transportation system because that's not one of the options that a market provides. I can choose this doctor or that doctor. I can't choose a national health care system. That's not an option on the market. These are options for societies, and in a reasonable world, democratic societies, and in a more reasonable world, societies where everything's under popular control, so socialist societies or anarchist societies. But markets don't allow any of that. So they're heavily biased in favor of certain kinds of outcomes, which are in many ways antisocial outcomes. I mean, with regard to, say, public transportation, one of the outcomes may be destruction of the species. There's nothing in markets that gives any incentive to care about whether your grandchildren survive. That's, choices aren't there. So equality, even human survival, is not really very likely under market societies. And in fact, there are a lot of illusions about that. I mean, it's commonly believed that the United States is a market society with entrepreneurial initiative and consumer choice and all those wonderful things. But it's very far from that. In fact, the very place where we're sitting is a good illustration of what's MIT. MIT is technically a private institution, but it's publicly funded through the government. What is it funded for? Well, it's funded to create the technology of the future, which private corporations can make profit on. So, say, the main elements of the productive economy now, like computers and the internet, were developed right here in similar places under Pentagon funding for decades, not a short period. The public was paying the costs for a long period. The public was taking the risks, and it finally ends up in Bill Gates's pockets.
Right.
But and that's the way most of the high-tech economy works. So where's the market society? I mean, it's there. It's at the marketing end. It's there. So, and even there, marketing is carried out in a way intended purposely to undermine markets. I mean, in fact, we all kind of know it, but we parrot the words without recognizing it. So you've seen television ads, I assume. I suppose there's a television ad for a drug or a car or something. I mean, in a market society, what you would have is a description of the properties of the commodity. Because then you get what are called informed consumers making rational choices. But that's not what you get. What you get is forms of delusion, because the business wants to create uninformed consumers who make irrational choices. That is, they want to undermine markets, which is very much like the political system. You want an electorate which is uninformed and makes irrational choices, undermine democracy. So the whole kind of ideology is so remote from reality that it's impossible almost to discuss. And this is not something like quantum physics. This is something right in front of everyone's eyes. It takes a tremendous amount of indoctrination to be able to produce journalists and commentators and academics and others who can talk about it as a free market society, because it's right in front of your eyes that it's nothing of the sort. So that really takes effective indoctrination. And it's not that people are lying. I mean, it's worse than that. It's internalized. You really believe the falsehoods that you're producing, like a well-run totalitarian society or a well-run religious faith, where people don't lie when they say there are miracles. They believe it. And the people aren't lying when they say it's a market society. It's just sort of driven into them that you don't question it, even though the counter evidence is right in your face.
What gives you hope and makes you happy?
People like you. That's where the hope is. In fact, There have been a lot of positive changes in the last, in, say, my lifetime, the last 30, 40 years, sort of active political lifetime. Matter of fact, since I was a kid, things are nowhere near as bad as what I was watching during the Depression.
Yeah.
A lot of achievements were made during the New Deal, and they didn't come from above. They came from activism. By the time workers were carrying out sit-down strikes, which is like one step before taking over the factory and running it for yourself, which really put the fear of God into the business world. So there were measures introduced which were good measures, like say Social Security, minimal welfare state measures, some degree of regulation, and so on. All right, that was positive, and it happened again in the '60s. There was a lot of popular activism, I have to say, and it made a huge effect. I mean, it first of all led Johnson to introduce extensions of welfare state measures, but it also just changed the culture. I mean, the role of minorities, women, environment, all sorts of things that just weren't questions even, came to the center of the agenda, ended up being a much more civilized society. In the 1980s, there was a growth of international solidarity movements, something which had never existed in the history of imperialism. In the whole history of imperialism, nobody thought of of going to the country that's under attack and living in villages with people to help them and protect them with a white face. I mean, the idea didn't occur to anyone. I mean, tens of thousands of people were doing it in the 80s, and it's grown all over in Central America. And incidentally, a lot of them were coming out of conservative religious circles. Religion in the United States is a very multifaceted affair. A lot were affected by liberation theology. A lot were coming out of the evangelical movement. One of Obama's half a dozen pastors is Jim Wallace, who comes out of that sector. I mean, evangelical Christianity, which was dedicated to social service. And out of that came the solidarity movement that's since extended, and the current global justice movement, which is a huge movement, mostly young people, meets in the World Social Forum, other social forums, has all kinds of programs, and that's positive advances. And there's no particular reason why that should stop. There's plenty of, in fact, we're better off now than earlier, because you can build on the successes of earlier generations. You start from a higher level. Right. So plenty of problems, but no reason to lose hope.